There is a moment in every human connection when something shifts beneath the surface, unseen yet deeply felt, when the familiar rhythm begins to fracture, when presence becomes absence, and certainty dissolves into quiet tension. It is in this moment that the psyche awakens, not in calm awareness, but in disturbance. When someone feels they are losing you, it is not merely about your absence. It is about what your absence represents within them. You are no longer just a person in their life. You become a symbol, a projection, a reflection of something they have not fully understood within themselves. The human mind does not easily accept loss, especially when it has grown accustomed to emotional security. What was once predictable now becomes uncertain, and uncertainty is where the unconscious begins to speak. It whispers through anxiety, through curiosity, through a sudden and unexplainable need to reconnect. This is where the shadow emerges. The parts of them that remained hidden, ignored, or suppressed begin to rise. Their need for control, their fear of abandonment, their unacknowledged attachment, all come forward at once, not because they have changed overnight, but because your withdrawal has removed the illusion of stability they once relied on. Distance creates a mirror, and in that mirror they begin to see what they could not see before: the value they underestimated, the connection they took for granted, the presence they assumed would always remain. But this realization does not come peacefully. It comes with inner conflict. Part of them wants to maintain their pride, to appear unaffected, to preserve the identity they have constructed. But another part, deeper and more instinctive, pushes them toward action. It creates a tension that cannot be ignored. And from this tension, a surprising move is born, not always calculated, not always consistent, but deeply revealing. They may reach out unexpectedly, break their silence, or act in ways that seem out of character. This is not randomness. It is the psyche attempting to restore balance, to regain what feels like it is slipping away. What surprises you is not the action itself, but the intensity behind it. Because when something is no longer guaranteed, it becomes significant. When access is limited, desire expands. And when presence is withdrawn, awareness is forced. Understand this. Their reaction is not truly about you leaving. It is about what your leaving awakens within them. A confrontation with their own depth, their own fears, their own unmet needs. And in that confrontation, they are no longer acting from who they believe themselves to be. They are acting from what they have tried to avoid all along. This is why their next move will surprise you, because it is not coming from the surface. It is coming from the unconscious depths, where truth cannot be hidden and control no longer exists. The psyche reacts most intensely when it senses loss of control, because control is not merely a preference, but a psychological anchor that creates the illusion of stability and safety within the inner world. When that control begins to slip, even subtly, the mind does not respond with calm observation, but with heightened alertness, as if something essential is under threat. This reaction is rarely logical. It is deeply instinctive, rooted in the unconscious layers where survival patterns and emotional conditioning reside. Control allows a person to predict outcomes, to feel secure in how others respond, and to maintain a sense of identity within relationships. When that predictability is disrupted, the psyche interprets it as danger, even if no real harm is present. What changes is not the external situation alone, but the internal meaning attached to it. The mind begins to question, to analyze, to search for certainty where there is none. And this search creates tension that grows stronger the more it is resisted. This intensity is amplified because loss of control exposes vulnerability. It removes the protective structure that once kept uncomfortable emotions contained. Feelings such as fear, insecurity, and attachment rise to the surface, demanding recognition. The individual may not consciously understand why they feel restless or unsettled, but the inner disturbance continues to expand because it has been activated at a deeper level. In this state, behavior often shifts. A person may try to regain control through actions that seem unexpected or out of character. They may reach out more, withdraw completely, become overly attentive, or attempt to re-establish dominance in subtle ways. These reactions are not random. They are attempts by the psyche to restore balance and reduce the discomfort created by uncertainty. What makes this process powerful is that it reveals hidden dependencies. When control is intact, these dependencies remain invisible, masked by routine and familiarity. But once that control is threatened, the truth emerges. The individual begins to confront how much they relied on a certain dynamic, How much of their emotional stability was tied to something outside themselves? The psyche does not react to loss of control quietly. It reacts with urgency because it is being forced to adapt, to reorganize, and to face aspects of itself that were previously avoided. This is why the intensity feels overwhelming, not because the situation is extreme, but because the inner world has been disrupted in a way that cannot be easily ignored. Emotional distance activates the unconscious fear of abandonment, because connection is not experienced only in the present moment, but is deeply tied to earlier emotional imprints that shaped how closeness and separation are understood. When someone begins to withdraw, even slightly, the psyche does not interpret it as a simple shift in behavior. It interprets it as a potential loss of bond, and this perception awakens patterns that exist beneath conscious awareness. The fear that emerges is often disproportionate to the situation because it is not rooted in logic. It is rooted in memory, in past experiences where distance may have meant rejection, neglect, or emotional absence. These experiences are stored within the unconscious and remain inactive until something in the present resembles them. Emotional distance becomes the trigger that brings these hidden associations to life. What intensifies this reaction is the lack of clarity. When communication becomes less frequent or less emotionally engaged, the mind is left to fill in the gaps. The unconscious does not tolerate uncertainty well, so it begins to create narratives, often negative, to explain what is happening. Doubt replaces certainty, and the imagination amplifies the perceived threat. The person is no longer responding to reality alone, but to the meaning their psyche has constructed around it. This process creates an inner tension that seeks resolution. The individual may feel an urge to close the distance, to restore connection, or to seek reassurance. These impulses are not always expressed openly. Sometimes they appear as overthinking, heightened sensitivity, or subtle shifts in behavior designed to regain attention or emotional closeness. Even withdrawal can become a response, as the psyche attempts to protect itself from the pain it anticipates. Emotional distance also disrupts the sense of emotional security that had been established. When someone feels consistently connected, they develop an internal expectation that the bond is stable. When that expectation is challenged, it creates a fracture in the inner world. The person begins to question not only the relationship, but also their own sense of worth within it. At a deeper level, the fear of abandonment is not only about losing another person. It is about confronting the possibility of being left alone with unresolved emotions. The presence of the other had in many ways helped regulate those emotions. When that presence fades, the individual is left to face what was previously managed through connection. The psyche reacts strongly because it is trying to avoid this confrontation. It seeks to restore closeness, to eliminate uncertainty, and to return to a state where the bond feels secure. This reaction is not weakness. It is a reflection of how deeply human beings are wired for connection and how profoundly the absence of it can be felt within the unconscious layers of the mind. What is no longer easily available becomes psychologically magnified because the human mind does not evaluate value in a purely rational way, but through perception, accessibility, and emotional tension. When something is readily present, it blends into familiarity and is often taken for granted. The psyche adapts quickly to consistency, and what is stable becomes less consciously noticed, even if it remains important. However, when access becomes restricted or uncertain, a shift occurs within the unconscious. The mind begins to assign greater significance to what is no longer consistently available. This is not because the object or person has changed, but because the absence creates a psychological gap that demands attention. The psyche is structured in such a way that it becomes more alert to what feels threatened or incomplete. This magnification is driven by uncertainty. When something is no longer guaranteed, the mind cannot settle into predictability. It begins to revisit memories, reinterpret past interactions, and search for meaning in what has changed. In this process, neutral experiences may take on greater emotional weight. Small moments are re-examined and their importance is amplified because the present lack creates contrast with the past presence. The unconscious also plays a key role in this process. It does not distinguish clearly between loss and temporary distance. Instead, it reacts to perceived absence as if something valuable is slipping away. This activates emotional energy that was previously dormant. The more unavailable something becomes, the more the psyche invests attention into it, often idealizing or reconstructing its importance beyond what was consciously acknowledged before. This mechanism is closely tied to desire. Desire does not grow in constant availability. It grows in space, in distance, in the tension between presence and absence. When access is limited, the mind begins to focus more intensely, creating emotional emphasis where familiarity once reduced awareness. At the same time, this magnification can distort perception. What was once ordinary may begin to appear essential, and what was once overlooked may suddenly feel irreplaceable. This is not a reflection of objective value, but of psychological reaction. The mind is responding to scarcity, not necessarily to true significance. This process reveals how perception is shaped more by availability than by inherent worth. The psyche amplifies what it cannot easily hold, because the absence creates an internal demand for resolution. In trying to resolve that tension, the mind elevates the importance of what is missing, turning distance into emotional weight and absence into intensified awareness. The shadow awakens when attachment feels threatened, because attachment is not only an emotional bond, but also a structure that holds unspoken expectations, insecurities, and unmet needs beneath the surface of awareness. When that structure begins to feel unstable, the unconscious parts of the psyche that were previously contained start to rise, bringing with them reactions that are often surprising, intense, and difficult to control. The shadow represents everything within the self that has been denied, suppressed, or left unintegrated. It contains emotional impulses that do not align with the conscious image a person holds of themselves. In times of stability, these elements remain hidden, managed by routines and predictable emotional patterns. But when attachment is threatened, the stability that kept them contained begins to weaken. This threat does not need to be extreme. Even subtle signs of distance, withdrawal, or emotional uncertainty can activate the deeper layers of the psyche. The mind interprets the possibility of loss not just as a relational shift, but as an internal disruption. What was once secure now feels uncertain, and uncertainty creates psychological pressure that seeks expression. As this pressure builds, the shadow begins to emerge through emotion and behavior. Feelings such as jealousy, fear, longing, control, or sudden emotional reactivity may surface. These responses are not random. They are fragments of the inner self that were previously unacknowledged but now demand attention because the attachment that held them in balance feels unstable. What makes this process powerful is that it reveals the hidden dependency within the connection. When attachment is secure, these underlying dynamics remain unnoticed. But when it is threatened, the emotional foundation is exposed, and the psyche reacts in ways that are not always aligned with conscious intentions. The shadow does not appear to destroy, but to express what has been ignored. It brings forward the parts of the self that were quietly influencing behavior beneath awareness. In moments of perceived loss, these parts become louder, seeking recognition through emotional intensity or action. This awakening can feel overwhelming because it bypasses rational control. The individual may feel reactions that seem disproportionate to the situation, yet they are experiencing the accumulation of suppressed emotional content rising to the surface. At its core, this process is not only about attachment to another person, but also about attachment to emotional stability itself. When that stability is questioned, the psyche turns inward and reveals what has been hidden. The shadow awakens not because love is disappearing, but because the mind can no longer maintain the illusion of control over what it fears to lose. Withdrawal disrupts patterns and forces inner confrontation because human behavior is deeply organized around repetition, familiarity, and emotional expectation. In relationships, people unconsciously develop cycles of interaction that provide a sense of stability, even when those cycles are imperfect. These patterns create predictability, and predictability reduces psychological tension by making emotional outcomes feel manageable. When withdrawal occurs, whether emotional or physical, that predictable structure is interrupted. The mind no longer receives the signals it has learned to rely on, and this absence creates a break in automatic functioning. What once flowed unconsciously through habit now becomes uncertain, and in that uncertainty, awareness is forced inward. This disruption is not only external but internal. The psyche begins to register the change as a loss of reference point. The absence of familiar responses creates space where silence replaces reaction, and in that silence, previously ignored thoughts and emotions begin to surface. The mind can no longer remain fully occupied with external engagement, so it turns toward itself. Inner confrontation arises because withdrawal removes distraction. Without the continuity of interaction, the individual is left alone with thoughts that may have been previously avoided or softened through connection. This can include unresolved emotions, hidden expectations, or unacknowledged dependency patterns. What was once diffused through interaction now becomes concentrated within awareness. The disruption of patterns also challenges identity within the dynamic. People often understand themselves in relation to how others respond to them. When those responses change or disappear, the internal sense of certainty is shaken. This creates discomfort because the mind is forced to reevaluate assumptions that were previously taken for granted. In this state, emotional responses may intensify. Overthinking, reflection, longing, or resistance can emerge as the psyche attempts to restore equilibrium. These reactions are not random but represent the mind's effort to rebuild a sense of order within the disrupted system. Withdrawal also reveals what was previously stabilized by presence. Emotions that were balanced by interaction may become more noticeable in absence. This is why silence often feels louder than engagement, because it removes external structure and exposes internal content that was always present but not fully seen. At a deeper level, this process is not only about the other person withdrawing, but about the self encountering its own inner landscape without external support. The confrontation that follows is not punishment but exposure. It reveals how much of emotional balance depended on external consistency and how little was fully integrated internally. In this way, withdrawal becomes a psychological interruption that breaks habit and reveals truth, forcing the mind to face what was previously carried quietly beneath the surface of connection. Their next move is driven not by logic but by unresolved inattention, because human behavior is not governed solely by rational thought, but by the pressure of unconscious emotional forces that accumulate beneath awareness. Logic operates at the surface of the mind, where decisions are structured and explained, but beneath that surface exists a deeper current shaped by unmet needs, suppressed feelings, and psychological imbalance. When inner tension builds, it creates a state of discomfort that the psyche seeks to resolve. This tension often arises from uncertainty, emotional distance, or the disruption of attachment patterns. In such states, the mind is not primarily focused on clarity, but on relief. The goal shifts from making the most rational choice to restoring internal equilibrium. This is why the next action often appears unpredictable from an outside perspective. It is not always aligned with consistency or prior behavior patterns. Instead, it reflects an internal pressure that demands expression. The individual may act in ways that temporarily reduce emotional discomfort, even if those actions do not fully align with long-term reasoning. Unresolved inner tension can manifest as urgency. The mind begins to push toward resolution, seeking to close the gap created by uncertainty or emotional imbalance. This urgency bypasses careful reflection, replacing it with instinctive movement. What appears as sudden action is often the release of accumulated psychological pressure. At the unconscious level, attachment plays a significant role. When connection feels unstable, the psyche attempts to restore familiarity through behavior. This may involve reaching out, withdrawing, testing boundaries, or shifting emotional expression. These actions are not calculated strategies, but responses to internal discomfort seeking relief. The tension itself becomes the driving force. It is not the external situation alone that dictates behavior, but the internal inability to remain in a state of emotional balance. The psyche prioritizes relief over analysis when pressure reaches a certain threshold. This is why their next move can feel surprising or inconsistent. It is shaped less by what makes sense externally and more by what feels necessary internally. The mind is attempting to regulate emotional intensity, even if the method of doing so is not fully conscious. At its core, this process reveals that human action is often a negotiation between awareness and unconscious pressure. Logic may outline the path, but unresolved tension determines the step taken. The next move is therefore not simply a decision, but an emotional release seeking temporary stability within an unsettled inner world.